I stood on my daughter Lily's front porch, clutching my suitcase handle so tight my knuckles turned white. Christmas lights twinkled around the doorway, and I could smell turkey cooking inside. After driving 3 hours through the snow, I was excited to spend the holidays with my only child and her family. At 67, these moments meant everything to me since my husband passed 2 years ago. The door swung open, but instead of Lily's warm smile, I faced my son-in-law Daniel's cold stare. His arms were crossed, and his jaw was set in a hard line. "You're late," he said flatly. Before I could explain about the traffic, he stepped aside just enough for me to squeeze past him. "Sleep in the garage," he ordered, his voice cutting through the warm air like ice. "You don't belong inside my house." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stood there trembling, not from the cold outside, but from the shock of his cruelty. My own daughter's husband was treating me like an unwanted stranger. I dragged my suitcase toward the garage, my legs feeling weak beneath me. The concrete floor was freezing, and I could see my breath in the dim light. Daniel had thrown an old camping cot in the corner with a thin blanket that smelled like motor oil. This was where he expected me to sleep on Christmas Eve. Through the thin walls, I could hear laughter and music from the warm house where my daughter sat with her family. Tears filled my eyes, but they weren't just from the cold seeping through my coat. The betrayal cut deeper than any winter wind. Where was Lily in all this? Why hadn't she stood up for me? I lay down on the cot, still wearing my coat, and stared at the ceiling. Rage began to spark beneath my sorrow. How dare he treat me this way? How dare my own daughter allow it? I had raised her better than this. As I shivered in that garage, something hardened inside my heart. This humiliation would not go unanswered. Daniel had made a terrible mistake thinking I was just some helpless old woman he could push around. Morning came with the sound of Daniel's loud voice carrying from the kitchen. I crept closer to the door connecting the garage to the house and pressed my ear against it. He was talking to someone on the phone, and his words made my blood run cold. "Yeah, I finally put the old woman in her place," he bragged. "She's sleeping in the garage like the burden she is. Should have done this years ago." Laughter echoed from the other end of the phone. My chest tightened as I realized this wasn't just a moment of cruelty. This was calculated. Daniel had planned this humiliation, probably for months. He wanted to break my spirit and show me exactly where I stood in his world. The worst part was hearing Lily's voice in the background, not defending me, just quietly making breakfast. My own daughter had become a silent partner in my degradation. I clutched the doorframe to steady myself. This wasn't just about a place to sleep. This was about erasing my dignity, making me feel worthless and unwelcome. But Daniel had seriously underestimated who he was dealing with. I wasn't going down without a fight. I walked back to my cot and sat down heavily, my mind racing. Enough was enough. For too long, I had accepted Daniel's disrespect, his snide comments, his efforts to push me out of Lily's life. I had stayed quiet to keep peace, thinking things would get better. But they had only gotten worse. He thought I was weak, just some helpless widow who would take whatever treatment he dished out. He was about to learn how wrong he was. I straightened my shoulders and made a silent vow. "They think I'm weak," I whispered to myself, "but they'll never see what's coming." This garage might be cold, but my resolve was burning hot. Daniel had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He had humiliated me in the worst possible way on Christmas of all days. But this would be his last victory over me. From now on, the game would be played by my rules. I had lived 67 years, survived losing my husband, raised a child on my own, and built a life from nothing. Daniel was about to discover what happens when you corner someone with nothing left to lose. At breakfast, Daniel continued his performance. He made jokes about my age, commented on how much space I took up, and suggested I might be more comfortable at a nursing home. Each insult was delivered with a smile, like he was being helpful rather than cruel. Lily sat there cutting pancakes for her children, saying nothing. Her silence hurt more than Daniel's words. I remained quiet, but inside, something was changing. Every sneer, every mocking laugh was fuel for the fire building in my chest. After breakfast, I pulled out a small leather notebook I always carried and began writing. I documented every cruel word, every humiliating moment, every time Lily stayed silent while her husband destroyed me. Daniel noticed me writing and laughed. "What's that, a diary? Writing about your exciting garage adventures?" The children giggled, not understanding they were witnessing their father's biggest mistake. I just smiled and kept writing. If Daniel wanted to play games, I would play too. But my game would have consequences he couldn't imagine. This notebook would become the foundation of his downfall, though he was too arrogant to see it coming. That afternoon, while Daniel was watching football and Lily was napping, I went through my suitcase carefully. Hidden in a side pocket were documents I had brought for safekeeping, important papers I didn't want to leave at home during the holidays. My fingers found what I was looking for, a copy of the house deed. My heart started beating faster as I read the names listed as owners. There it was, clear as day. Lily Thompson and Margaret Thompson, joint tenants with right of survivorship. Daniel's name was nowhere to be found. I remembered now, 8 years ago when they were first married and looking to buy a house. They were young, had student loans, and couldn't qualify for a mortgage on their own. I had co-signed and put my name on the deed to help them. We had all forgotten about it over the years, or so I thought. But legal documents don't forget. According to this paper, I owned half of the house Daniel had just banned me from. The irony was delicious. The man who told me I didn't belong in his house didn't even legally own it. I folded the papers carefully and smiled for the first time since arriving. Later that evening, I found Lily alone in the kitchen, washing dishes. This was my chance to test where she truly stood. I approached her carefully, my voice soft and non-threatening. "Lily, sweetheart," I said, "do you really think I deserve to sleep in the garage?" She froze, her hands still in the soapy water. For a moment, I thought she might apologize, might finally stand up for me. Instead, she glanced toward the living room where Daniel was watching TV, then whispered urgently, "Please, Mom, don't cause problems. You know how he gets when he's upset." Her words cut deeper than Daniel's cruelty ever could. This was my daughter, the little girl I had raised alone after her father left, the child I had sacrificed everything for. And she was choosing her husband's comfort over her mother's dignity. "I understand," I said quietly, but inside I was screaming. The betrayal was complete. I wasn't just fighting Daniel anymore. I was alone in this battle. Lily had made her choice, and it wasn't me. That night, lying on the cold cot, I realized I had to save myself. No one else was coming to my rescue. The next morning, I announced I was going for a walk to get some fresh air. Daniel barely looked up from his coffee, probably relieved to have me out of the house. Instead of walking aimlessly, I headed straight to the law offices downtown. I had looked up the address the night before on my phone. The lawyer, Mrs. Harrison, was a kind woman in her 50s who specialized in property law. When I explained my situation and showed her the deed, her eyes widened. "Mrs. Thompson," she said carefully, "you realize what this means, don't you? You have legal ownership of half that property." I nodded, feeling a spark of hope for the first time in days. She explained my rights and options, speaking slowly, so I understood everything clearly. "Your son-in-law has been living in a house he doesn't legally own," she continued. "And he certainly has no right to dictate where you sleep in your own property." As I walked back to the house, I felt different, stronger. The pieces of my revenge were finally falling into place. Daniel thought he held all the power, but he was about to learn otherwise. That evening, I pretended to read in the living room while Daniel took a business call in the kitchen. His voice carried easily, and what I heard made me smile. His construction company was in serious financial trouble. Orders were down, clients weren't paying on time, and he was behind on several important bills. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," he told whoever was on the other end. "The bank is asking questions, and I'm running out of options." I kept my face neutral, but inside I was celebrating. Daniel's arrogance had always been backed by his financial success. He treated people poorly because he thought his money made him untouchable. But money has a way of disappearing, and without it, bullies become very small indeed. His business problems weren't my fault, but they would make my revenge so much sweeter. A man who was losing everything would be especially vulnerable to losing the one thing he thought was secure, his home. I made another note in my leather journal. Daniel's business failing. Perfect timing. The garage humiliation might soon cost him everything he had worked for. The next morning, Mrs. Caldwell from next door knocked on the front door. She was a sweet woman in her 70s who had always been kind to me during previous visits. Daniel reluctantly let her in, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "I brought some cookies for Margaret," she said, looking around the living room. "Is she here?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "She's resting," he said vaguely. But Mrs. Caldwell was sharper than he expected. "I saw her carrying blankets into the garage yesterday," she said quietly. "Is everything all right?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. When I appeared from the kitchen, Mrs. Caldwell's eyes filled with concern. She had put the pieces together and knew exactly what was happening. After Daniel stomped off in frustration, she pulled me aside. "My dear," she whispered, "this isn't right. No one should treat their mother-in-law this way." I found myself confiding in her, telling her about the garage, the humiliation, everything. Her face grew stern. "When the time comes," she promised, "I'll stand by you. This man needs to be stopped." I had found my first ally in this war, and it felt like a victory. Daniel caught me talking quietly with Mrs. Caldwell by the front fence the next day. His face turned red with anger as he stormed over to us. "What are you two gossiping about?" he demanded. Mrs. Caldwell stood her ground. "I was just checking on Margaret's health," she said calmly. "She seems to be having trouble staying warm." Daniel's eyes flashed with rage. "Don't meddle with my family," he growled at her. "What happens in my house is none of your business." "Mrs. Caldwell looked him up and down with disgust. "Treating elderly people poorly is everyone's business," she replied. Daniel slammed the front door so hard the windows rattled. Later, I sat in the garage writing in my notebook. His reaction told me everything I needed to know. He was scared of outside attention, scared of people knowing how he really treated me. That fear would be his weakness. I wrote carefully, "One door will close forever." Daniel thought he could control who entered and left his world, but he was about to learn that some doors, once closed, can never be reopened. His treatment of Mrs. Caldwell had been another mistake in a growing list of errors. Monday morning, while Daniel was at work and Lily was running errands, I returned to Mrs. Harrison's office. This time, I wasn't just seeking advice. I was ready to take action. "I want to file a legal notice asserting my ownership of the property," I told her firmly. She smiled approvingly. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say." We spent an hour going through paperwork, making sure every detail was correct. Mrs. Harrison explained that once the notice was filed, Daniel would receive official documentation that the house deed was being reviewed and that my ownership claim was being processed. "He'll have no choice but to take this seriously," she assured me. "You have more control than he realizes." As I signed the papers, my hand was steady. This was the first real move in my chess game against Daniel. He had treated me like I was powerless, like I had no options or resources. He was about to discover how wrong he was. Walking back to the house, I felt lighter somehow. The legal system was now on my side, and Daniel's comfortable world was about to be shaken to its foundation. He thought he held all the cards, but I was about to show him my hand. That evening, Daniel invited some business associates over for dinner. He was trying to project success despite his financial problems, serving expensive wine and talking loudly about future projects. I was allowed to eat with them, but Daniel made sure to humiliate me throughout the meal. "Be careful not to let old women near your houses," he joked to his guests. "They'll try to claim ownership of everything, even the garage." The men laughed, not knowing they were witnessing something far more serious than a family joke. "Pretty soon she'll want her name on the deed," Daniel continued, slapping the table in amusement. His guests chuckled along, but I noticed one of them looking uncomfortable. If only Daniel knew how close to the truth his joke really was. I smiled pleasantly and said nothing, but inside I was savoring the irony. In a few days, he would receive papers that would make his cruel joke a living nightmare. Let him laugh now. Soon he would discover that sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of humor, and the powerless old woman he mocked actually held the power to destroy everything he thought he owned. 3 days later, the official letter arrived. I was in the kitchen when Daniel came storming in, waving the legal documents in the air like a weapon. His face was purple with rage, and veins bulged in his neck. "What is this?" he screamed, throwing the papers on the counter. Lily picked them up with shaking hands and read aloud, "Notice of deed review and ownership claim." Her face went white as she realized what was happening. "The house deed is being reviewed," she whispered. Daniel whirled around to face her. "Did you know about this? Did you help her?" His voice was getting louder and more dangerous. "Did you betray me?" Lily started crying, insisting she knew nothing. She ran to find me, panic written all over her face. "Mom, what did you do? What are these papers about?" I looked at my daughter calmly and spoke just loud enough for Daniel to hear from the kitchen. "Doors have locks, my dear," I said simply. "And sometimes the keys change hands." The sound of Daniel cursing and throwing things around the kitchen told me my message had been received loud and clear. The game was truly beginning now. Daniel cornered me in the living room, the legal papers crumpled in his fist. For the first time since I had known him, he looked genuinely scared. "What do you think you're doing, old woman?" he demanded. I sat calmly in my chair, looking up at him with steady eyes. "I'm claiming what's mine," I replied simply. "What are you talking about?" he sputtered. "This is my house." I reached into my purse and pulled out the copy of the original deed, unfolding it slowly for dramatic effect. "Actually, Daniel, this house belongs to Lily and me. You're not on the deed at all." I watched his face drain of color as he read his own address with my name listed as co-owner. For the first time in years, Daniel stammered. He tried to grab the paper from my hands, but I pulled it away. "How, when did this can't be legal?" he muttered. "It's perfectly legal," I assured him. "I co-signed for this house 8 years ago when you two couldn't qualify alone. We all forgot about it over the years. Well, almost all of us." I smiled sweetly. "Perhaps now I'll choose which room you belong in. What do you think about the garage? It has such a nice concrete floor." Daniel spent the next hour on the phone with lawyers, his voice getting more frantic with each call. When he finished, he came back to me with a different approach. Gone was the angry bully, replaced by a desperate man trying to make a deal. "Look, Margaret," he said, using my name for the first time in years. "Let's be reasonable here. I can pay you to sign the house over to us. Name your price." I pretended to consider his offer, while inside I laughed at his desperation. "How much are we talking about?" I asked. His eyes lit up with hope. 50,000? 75? I can get a loan against my business. I shook my head slowly. "Daniel, you had your chance to treat me with respect. You chose to humiliate me instead. You slammed that door yourself." His face started turning red again. "You can't be serious about this. Where would we live? What about Lily and the kids?" I looked at him with the same cold expression he had given me that first night. "You should have thought about that before you ordered me to sleep in the garage. Actions have consequences, and yours are finally catching up with you." The tables had completely turned, and Daniel was learning what it felt like to be powerless. Daniel's mask of politeness disappeared completely. He exploded in a rage unlike anything I had seen before, screaming threats and insults. "You think you can just waltz in here and take my house? I'll throw you out on the street. I'll make sure you never see your grandchildren again." His face was twisted with fury, and spittle flew from his mouth as he yelled. But I had faced down scarier men than Daniel in my 67 years. I stood up slowly, meeting his wild eyes with calm determination. "Try it," I said quietly, "and you'll lose more than your house. You'll lose everything." Something in my voice made him pause. "I have documentation of your abuse, witnesses to your behavior, and legal rights you can't touch. Push me any further, and I'll make sure the whole town knows exactly what kind of man you really are." Daniel's confidence was crumbling before my eyes. He had spent years building his reputation as a successful businessman and family man. The thought of losing that facade terrified him more than losing the house. I could see him calculating the costs of a public battle, and for the first time, he was realizing he might not win. Mrs. Caldwell proved to be more valuable than I had expected. She had been quietly documenting Daniel's treatment of me and had spoken to other neighbors about what she witnessed. 2 days after my confrontation with Daniel, she arrived at the house with Mrs. Peterson from across the street and Mr. James from 2 doors down. They each carried written statements describing what they had seen and heard. "We've provided sworn affidavits about Daniel's behavior," Mrs. Caldwell announced. "The court will be very interested in these testimonies." Daniel tried to dismiss them, but his bravado was fading fast. Word was spreading through the neighborhood about the legal battle, and people were taking sides. His business partners started asking uncomfortable questions about his personal life. Clients began looking at him differently. The man who had once commanded respect through fear and intimidation was becoming a community scandal. His reputation, which he had worked years to build, was crumbling in a matter of days. I watched it all with satisfaction, knowing that every whispered conversation and every suspicious glance was another nail in the coffin of his arrogance. He was learning that humiliating people publicly has consequences when the truth comes to light. Lily came to me with tears streaming down her face, begging me to stop the legal proceedings. She was caught between her husband and her mother, and the stress was destroying her. "Please, Mom," she pleaded. "Can't we work this out as a family? Daniel is sorry for what he did." I looked at my daughter with sadness and disappointment. "Where were you when he ordered me to sleep in the garage? Where were you when he humiliated me in front of his friends? Where were you when I needed my daughter to stand up for me?" She had no answer for that. "You chose silence when I needed support," I continued. "You chose his comfort over my dignity. When you chose silence, you chose him. This is no longer just my fight. It's about standing up to bullies who think they can treat people however they want without consequences." Lily cried harder, but I remained firm. I loved my daughter, but I couldn't let that love enable her husband's cruelty. Sometimes the people we love most need to face the hardest truths. Daniel had spent years poisoning her against me, and now she was reaping what he had sown. The court date arrived faster than I expected. I walked into the courthouse wearing my best dress, carrying my folder of documents and evidence. Daniel sat at the defendant's table with his lawyer, but his usual confidence was nowhere to be seen. He kept glancing around the courtroom nervously, probably hoping none of his business associates would show up. Mrs. Harrison presented our case methodically, showing the original deed, the co-signing documents, and the evidence of my continuous financial interest in the property. Daniel's lawyer tried to argue that my name on the deed was a technicality, that I had abandoned any real claim to the house. But Mrs. Harrison countered with the affidavits from neighbors describing my regular visits and Daniel's recent abusive treatment. The judge listened carefully to both sides, asking pointed questions about the timeline and the current living situation. When Daniel tried to speak on his own behalf, his voice cracked with stress. The same man who had boldly humiliated me in front of guests was now stumbling over his words in front of a judge. The power dynamic had completely reversed, and everyone in that courtroom could see it. News of the court case spread through town like wildfire. Daniel's construction business started losing clients who didn't want to be associated with someone involved in elder abuse allegations. His friends began distancing themselves, and business partners started questioning their relationships with him. The man who had once been respected in the community was becoming a pariah. I heard through Mrs. Caldwell that people were talking about the case at the grocery store, the bank, and the coffee shop. Daniel's arrogance had become a community scandal, and public opinion was firmly against him. His attempts to portray me as a greedy old woman seeking money fell flat when people learned about the garage incident. Even his own employees were whispering doubts about working for someone who would treat his mother-in-law so cruelly. The social consequences of his actions were proving to be almost as devastating as the legal ones. His carefully constructed image as a successful family man was crumbling, and everyone could see the real Daniel underneath, a bully who picked on people he thought couldn't fight back. Mrs. Caldwell was called as a witness, and her testimony was devastating. She described in detail what she had observed: me carrying blankets into the garage while the family enjoyed warmth inside, Daniel's cruel jokes at my expense, and his threats when she tried to help me. Her voice was steady and clear as she painted a picture of systematic abuse and humiliation. I watched this poor woman shiver in a garage while her own family feasted in comfort, she told the courtroom. It was the most heartless thing I've ever witnessed. The judge's expression grew stern as he listened to her account. Other spectators in the courtroom gasped audibly when she described finding me crying on Christmas morning after being banned from the house. Daniel buried his face in his hands, realizing that his private cruelty was now public knowledge. His lawyer had no effective cross-examination because Mrs. Caldwell's observations were simply facts, not opinions that could be disputed. When she finished testifying, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. Everyone present understood that they had just heard testimony about real cruelty, not a simple family disagreement. The judge's verdict was swift and decisive. "Mr. Thompson," he said, looking directly at Daniel, "your treatment of Mrs. Thompson has been unconscionable. Regardless of family dynamics, no person should be forced to sleep in a garage while others enjoy comfort in a home they partially own." He ruled that I had full legal rights to half the property and that Daniel must vacate the premises immediately. Mrs. Thompson and her daughter will remain as the sole occupants of the house. Mr. Daniel Thompson has forfeited any claim to residency through his actions. The gavel came down with finality, and Daniel's world shattered in that moment. His lawyer patted his shoulder sympathetically, but there was nothing more they could do. Lily sobbed quietly in the gallery, realizing her husband was being forced to leave their home. I felt a mix of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but at the cost of my daughter's marriage. As we filed out of the courtroom, Daniel wouldn't even look at me. He had lost everything he thought was secure, and it was all his own fault. The door he had slammed on my dignity was now permanently closed to him. Moving day was awkward and tense. Daniel packed his belongings in angry silence while Lily tried to mediate between us. I watched him load boxes into his truck, remembering how confident he had been just weeks before when he ordered me to the garage. Now he was the one being forced to leave, and the irony wasn't lost on either of us. When he finished packing, he stood at the front door for a moment, looking back at the house he thought he owned. I walked over to him, and for a brief second, I saw something that might have been remorse in his eyes. "This didn't have to happen," I said quietly. "If you had treated me with basic human dignity, none of this would have been necessary." He opened his mouth as if to say something, then thought better of it. Instead, he walked out the door, and I closed it firmly behind him. As the lock clicked into place, I whispered the words I had written in my notebook weeks earlier. "This is the door you'll never reopen." Through the window, I watched him drive away, taking his cruelty and arrogance with him. The house felt different immediately, lighter, warmer, free from the toxic energy he had brought to it. That evening, I sat by the fireplace in the living room, my living room now. No more garage, no more concrete floors, no more shivering under thin blankets. Lily sat across from me, her eyes red from crying. The house was quiet except for the crackling of the fire and the soft sounds of her children playing upstairs. "I'm sorry, Mom," she said finally. "I should have stood up for you from the beginning." I looked at my daughter, seeing both the little girl I had raised and the woman she had become. "Respect is the key to every home," I told her gently. "Your husband lost that key when he chose cruelty over kindness. You almost lost it too by choosing silence over courage." She nodded, understanding finally dawning in her eyes. "But people can earn respect back," I continued. "It takes time, and it takes courage to do what's right, even when it's hard." The fire cast warm shadows on the walls, and for the first time in years, I felt truly at peace in this house. Daniel had thought he could break my spirit, but instead he had awakened a strength I didn't know I still possessed. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up teaching us exactly how strong we really are. If you enjoyed this story of standing up to bullies and fighting for respect, please subscribe for more inspiring tales of justice and courage. Like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to get notifications on all our new stories daily.